Welcome to the Identity Politics Podcast, where faith meets the complexities of modern governance. Hosted by Dr. Stephen Phinney. Together, we'll explore the delicate balance between spiritual convictions and political realities. In each episode, we'll engage in thought-provoking discussions, challenging the norms and uncovering how biblical principles can guide us through today's political landscape. Whether you're a believer navigating the public square or simply curious about the intersection of faith and politics, this is the space for honest dialogue and meaningful insights. Let's get started. Please welcome our guest, Colonel John Mills, a national security professional with service in multiple eras: Cold War, peace dividend, war on terror, world in chaos, and now great power competitor. He is the former Director of Cybersecurity Policy, Strategy and International Affairs at the Department of Defense. Mr. Mills is a Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy. He is the author of The Nation Will Follow and War Against the Deep State. You can find Colonel Mills's writings on X, Substack, Getter, and Truth Social platforms. It is an honor to have Colonel Mills on the Identity Politics Podcast.
John, thank you for joining us today on the Identity Politics Podcast. And believe me, it's an honor to have you. When I first discovered you on Substack and started reading your essays that you post, I thought I discovered a gold mine. So that's why I reached out to you to see if you would have a few moments that you could come on the podcast and share with us some of the things that God has put upon your heart to address in our present culture, or I should say political culture, that we're experiencing today. So it's an honor to have you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that, and an honor to be on your show and getting to know you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit about your family and where you live. And from what I read, you're now in retirement, but I'd like to have our listeners get to know you just a little bit more.
Well, thank you, Stephen. People often ask me that, are you retired? And not really. I'm retired from the U.S. government. I'm retired from the military, but I mean, I do plenty of other things. I worked for a think tank for about 5 years, the Aerospace Corporation, but now I just do essentially media. You'll see me on Newsmax. You'll see me on, and I also on a number of media, Steve Bannon's War Room, occasionally on Fox, things like that, NTD. But I also write regularly for Newsmax, for Epic Times, and for the Gateway Pundit. So, but also national interest. So I'm totally in media now is what I do.
Awesome. Yeah, you just mentioned probably the top platforms that I gather my news. And I've done a little bit of writing, for Epic Times and a couple interviews or whatever. But I appreciate your mindset when it comes to the whole issues that our country is facing today. And to be perfectly blunt, there's really not many out there that I can find that maintain the conservative values and principles that our nation was built upon. So I really do appreciate the work that you do on these platforms. And since I'm a big Substack guy, I certainly appreciate the articles that you put out that are either going to develop, haters or hit the delete button type people, or those like me that are going to take that time to read what you are observing that is going on in our country today. So
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I go to Heritage Independent Baptist Church in Woodbridge, Virginia, and we love that. The founding pastor, Michael Edwards, he's retired, but he's not really retired. He's with SharePoint Ministries in North Carolina, goes to his son's church in Charlotte. Our pastor, just wonderful, and Mark Carpenter. But something Pastor Edwards taught was, to write a good message. It's very clear and simple. And this is connected to the way I try to write in all these venues. He says have 3 points, and you have 3 points about those 3 points, and then you get off the stage. Okay, that's the theme. And so I try to stick to that. And Substack, now we're a little concerned with Substack because there's some new C-suite people who have been brought on that come from the fact-checking world. And we now know enough that we know anybody who calls themselves a fact checker is really a globalist, elite, totalitarian. Just like to be snobby about it and use fancy words. Okay, they're totalitarian.
Right.
It was Robert Malone, Dr. Malone, who just put out a note on that just a couple of days ago. But that's the way I try to write on Substack. I appreciate that. It's always been something that I've done. I used to put out emails for the 2000 campaign, the 2004. But, like many people, my email inbox is, overwhelmed. And I started going into the mode of, and some people came to me, well, you like to write. Why don't you put out great emails? Why don't you start writing? It was actually Epoch Times was the first to approach me and said, well, why don't you channel that energy into some writing for us? I've written for them for 5 years. And I expanded it. Jim Hoft, I appreciate Jim Hoft reached out to me from the Gateway Pundit. And it was, Steve Bannon was the one who really was the first one to give me media time and airtime. And I appreciate Steve Bannon so much. But it was, and Christopher Ruddy at Newsmax. He just reached out to me. I had no idea who Christopher Ruddy was. He just reached out to me, and I asked one of my colleagues, Frank Gaffney, who is Christopher Ruddy? And he goes, John, that's the CEO of Newsmax. And I said, yes, he is. I knew that. I knew that. Just checking to see.
Yeah, just checking.
So it's been a great relationship, and I appreciate everybody. And I look at this. God has given me a bit of a megaphone, a way to communicate, and I try to use it for good purposes. Obviously, we live in a fallen world, but about an hour ago, you asked me where did I live, and about my family and things like that. So, we live in Woodbridge, Virginia. Again, just down the road from Heritage Baptist, just about a 5-minute drive. I've been married for,
better get it right.
Yeah, it's been coming up this year. It'll be 36 years. Met my wife in Sierra Vista, Arizona. I was going to my officer basic course at the officer basic course at the intelligence center at Fort Huachuca, and I was stopped at the Western Auto to get some seat covers. I had vinyl seat covers. I was from Seattle. I didn't know that vinyl seat covers were dangerous in Arizona.
Yes.
So was getting some seat covers, and I got into my car after getting the seat covers. This mail Jeep pulled up. My wife, that was during the old days when we had those wonderful mail Jeeps that you could drive with the doors open. She stopped, jumped out, ran, walked at a brisk pace in, delivered some mail, picked up some mail, jumped into the Jeep, and boom, she was gone. I said, wow, she was cute. I'd like to meet her. So I wrote a letter to the postmaster, and the postmaster within like 2 days, went and gave it to her. And 2 days later, I got a call, and the rest is history. Except that's how I met Christ, was through my wife.
Wow.
I was not saved. I was brought up Catholic, not criticizing the Catholic faith at all, but I was not saved. And the my wife, as we were dating, she says, you really need to get saved. If we're gonna continue on this relationship, you need to get saved. So she brought me to Pastor Tom Sears and his wife Cora, and they walked me through the Romans Road, and I accepted Christ.
Wow.
So that's that. And we have three children, an adult son, and an adult daughter, and then a about to be 18 daughter also. Just been a great walk and journey with Christ, and God's really blessed us in our journey over these years.
That's what kind of motivated me to contact you, is I kind of picked up on that in some of your media content, that you are a man of faith who understands politics. And that's my great love. It's why I do what I do. And you mentioned Substack, and I have a love-hate relationship with the platform because it is getting populated with hate speech. And since it's a free speech platform, they typically go after people like you and I. And so I call it dump and go. So we use most of the top platforms out there, and there's only a couple places that I will take the time to dialogue with individuals. One of them is Substack, if we develop a relationship like you and I did. But it's a dump and go for me to get the information out there. And I'm more of a cultural historian / church historian, and I have a pretty rich background in politics. And so I've kind of merged all that together to write on topics that deal with cultural movements that America is facing today. Now, I would like to have you share a couple moments in regard to your military background, because a part of making America great in the initial founding of this country was our views on military. And so I have noticed over the past few years is that there's been a decline of emphasis on making sure that our military is prepared to protect this country. And that was more than alarming to me because of my own research and studies. I know that military is a key part of keeping America founded or rooted in the foundation of how we were formed. So share with us a couple moments here about your military background and how it affects your views today.
Well, when I first came into the military in 1983, it was still, some people freak out when you say this, but it was still a Judeo-Christian firewall to one of the core values of America. Hey, I realize even our Constitution, we're a diverse country. There are faiths that are not Judeo-Christian. I get that. And we can still be Judeo-Christian, and that, no question about Judeo-Christian was a absolute foundation to our founding. But things have changed, and in 1983, it still was that firewall of goodness. And for the most part, we had officers and senior leaders that were relatively apolitical. Okay. It has changed over this journey. No question about it. No question about it. And I think when I really noticed it and realized something had changed And I'd like to give one point here. I think it was President H.W. Bush and the Republican Party at that time. They essentially chose to walk away from the values voters. They said, that values stuff, that's interesting, but that's really not that important. We're no longer going to cultivate that. That's a minority. That's Reagan and before. We're post Reagan. Values. Well, what happened to the country? Well, what happened to the country? We had so people came in that on the Republican side and the Democrat side that values were whatever you wanted them to be. And as you know, and we all know, once anything goes, anything goes.
Everything goes.
And so horrible situation. But it was in the military. I was at the Army War College in 2009, which is considered the pinnacle of an officer's career, and when I was selected to go to War College, I was called and complimented, by the, essentially from the senior military general, the chief of staff's office, and said, "Hey, congratulations, you made War College." And I go, "Okay." And I didn't mean to be flippant, but okay. I was
What's
just,
that?
yeah. Well, yeah. I was used to, being selected for the next rank and making the so, and I didn't realize how blessed I was because there was a huge attrition along the way, huge attrition. He goes, and the colonel said, Lieutenant Colonel Mills, do you realize that only 3% of your peer group make it this far and make it to War College? And I said, I knew that. Just checking to see that you knew that. So that really, I didn't realize the blessing there, and I didn't realize that it is a plucking process. It isn't it's a plucking process. So, but I was at War College, and one of the you have these group leaders that are usually retired colonels, and he didn't like my style of writing. And what really triggered him, and I will use that word triggered, was this is 2009, and I talked about, at that time, we didn't really know or understand about China at that time. We were still focused on war on terror. But I made a reference to communist China and the evil nature of their one-child policy. And he threatened essentially to have me removed from the course. He just said there was too many things in my writing that were too edgy. That's when I realized a narrative existed and something had changed in the military. So from 1983 to 2009, that's 26 years, something had changed. Now there was a narrative everybody was to align and correspond to. And I'm usually, as you know, there's always 10% who don't get the memo. I'm normally in that group, but obviously I'd missed the memo on this. There was no memo. It was just an accepted narrative. Right. Rome had an accepted narrative that everybody was to conform to. King Herod had an accepted narrative. So somehow we went from the firewall of goodness and foundational Judeo-Christian values to a secular narrative. Yikes. How did this happen? It was really a surrender of values. This Judeo-Christian thing, going to church on Sunday, going to Sunday school, midday service, evening service on Sunday, going to Wednesday night preaching, going to Saturday morning men's ministry, going door knocking, tithing. Are you kidding me? This is just too difficult. We're beyond that. What happens when we allow that behavior and attitude? Society collapses, and you start questioning basic things. Why have children? Why get married? And maybe I want to live an alternative lifestyle. Maybe I'm really a woman trapped in a man's body. And my policy has always been very consistent. Once we started going down this road, I'm going to identify as an endangered sea turtle, and the federal government owes me oceanfront property. That is I've been very consistent on that, and that was meant to be humorous. But this is the craziness that happens in society when just anything goes. Unfortunately, we've gone down this evolution.
Yeah, and the ideology of a slow fade. Our country is presently a pure example of how that works. When you take on one little idea and you integrate it into the nation or the military or whatever, the church, just one little idea, that automatically grants permission to expand that idea, to add to it. I too have seen that. I'm 70 years old, and now I look at what it is today in our country versus what it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. And since I'm a culture type of guy and watching the movements that happen within America very closely, and I have befriended other researchers and historians that are doing exactly the same thing. And we have come to this basic little ideology that American citizens have bought into, and that is just take a little bite and see for yourself. And so all those things that you just mentioned, from sexual identity issues to bringing culture into the church, worldly culture into the church. You have people who have not yet been redeemed by the life of Christ. And they're sitting in this audience, and they're still thinking, because they have bitten off more and more and more that has been presented to them on this platter of American culture. And so they become influencers in the church, of course. They become influencers in the government and so forth. Then you add a few years onto that, and you have what we have today. We have almost a depraved American culture. Now, what really gets me, John, is this whole idea of deep state. Now, this is something that I had heard of, certainly, and it is something that I knew was not right, and it's dangerous. But I didn't know enough about it to do any writing or podcasting about it or whatever. But when I started discovering the details of what's going on in regard to the deep state, I realized this is a whole level of politics that many Americans are totally uninformed about. And I know you've done a great deal of research when it comes to this whole deep state thing. Could you share with us a little bit about your discoveries?
Well, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I have 2 books out. The Nation Will Follow. It was about my time realizing, after a career in national security, I was living in the deep state and I was part of it. And then my second book is War Against the Deep State. But there was a seminal moment that I have in my first book where I realized. Now, it was a episode in June 2016. I was rushing to a meeting in the building, and that's what everybody does. They rush to meetings in the large Pentagon. And I ran into somebody that had worked in the Bush the administration, a good friend, somebody I looked to as a mentor. This was the Obama years, and I just a little surprised to see him in the building. And he goes, he says, well, I said, well, what are you doing in the building? And he goes, well, I'm a graybeard. I'm an advisor. I've been brought on. I go, okay, interesting. Republican, Bush, advisor with Obama. Okay, interesting. But then I don't normally talk political in the building, but I knew this person had been a political appointee. And I said, hey, it's coming up to the convention. You're going to support Trump, right? And his response changed everything. Not in the magnitude of me becoming saved in Christ, but a very important event. It changed everything on my view of what was going on in America, and everything Donald J. Trump was saying made sense in a split second. His response was, when I said, are you going to support Trump at the convention? His response was, no, we see more opportunities with her. And I just, in a nanosecond, I just about lunged and I said, who is we and what opportunities do you see? And at that, in a split second, everything Donald J. Trump was saying about the deep state, the swamp, made sense. And in the spring, I was not a Trump guy. I was actually really Ted Cruz guy. I liked all of the 16 running, even slow energy jab. Low energy jab. But after I saw Donald J. Trump knock out 16 in a row, I'm a little slow to pick up on these things. But I said, okay, I think he's the one. Okay, 16 KOs in a row. Yeah, I think he's the one. But that comment from a Bush appointee changed everything. And from that point on, I realized there was a swamp, there was a deep state. I was living right in the middle of it and really was part of it. And that is what we are trying to do, is totally, in the history of a nation, you'll get one leader where you can reset things back to the pathway they were supposed to be on. And we have one of the most God has given us. No other country in human history has had something called a constitution that is focused on the individual, not the continuation of the regime. And this is rare and precious. It is incredible. And so it is so important. But what we get one leader in the pathway of the history of a country that can reset things. And that's where we're living in history right now, with a leader who can actually reset things. This morning on LinkedIn, I saw a general officer friend of mine who I thought I knew well, who put this smarmy post out on this is metrics on the ascendancy of a totalitarian leader, which shows what a totalitarian Donald J. Trump is. And my gut and secular human reaction was to blast him on LinkedIn. And are you kidding me? But I just said, I'm going to pause and hold on this. But this shows the smarmy elitism that will figure out every possible response. This is called projection. They're projecting what they were doing to society onto Donald J. Trump and anybody who supports him. Projection is that classic communist tactic of blaming others for what they're doing themselves. So that's what we're dealing with. We got one leader, that's Donald J. Trump. And this is a rare moment to reset the country back onto the path that it's supposed to be on.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Identity Politics series. We hope you found our discussion insightful and thought-provoking. Your support and engagement mean the world to us. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Please stay connected with us on social media and visit our website at IOM America for more resources and updates on upcoming episodes. Visit us at iomamerica.net. Until next time, I'm Gregory Edwards, reminding you to stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going. Thank you for being a part of our community.